Australia, a country that is often defined by its multiculturalism and diversity. And now, this extensive range of cultural and linguistic backgrounds within our population can be seen reflected in our schools and their communities. However, cultural diversity is not the only point of difference among our students. Our classrooms are often filled with young people from varying socioeconomic or religious backgrounds, and students with impairments or disabilities that have an effect on their development of communicative competence, social skills, or intellectual ability. It is also important to mention that every student has a unique way of learning, and this also needs to be catered for within our classes. With this much diversity in all of our students, we need to ensure that we are implementing and exemplifying inclusive and ethical strategies in every element of our teaching practice. But what does inclusive practice look like? Hyde explains inclusive education as a process of responding to the uniqueness of individuals, increasing their sense of presence, access, participation, and engagement in schools. Therefore, with such an extensive role in education, inclusivity needs to be something that is intentional, planned for, and incorporated in a teacher's pedagogy. Research has shown that if this is achieved, then learning outcomes can be significantly improved. The following presentation will firstly introduce an effective framework for applying inclusive practice and explore the elements that make up this framework before exploring its application in a secondary English classroom. This video aims at explaining a pedagogical approach that has the potential to revolutionize the way we engage our students, no matter their backgrounds or learning needs. This is the 8 Ways of Learning, a pedagogical approach that was designed to cater to the different ways of learning and being that are characteristic to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. However, its unique structure and interrelated nature of its components make it an effective tool for addressing all kinds of diversity. The 8 pedagogies consist of story sharing, community links, deconstruct-reconstruct, non-linear learning, land links, symbols and images, non-verbal, and learning maps. The first way of learning is story sharing. The developers of the 8 Ways of Learning framework mention that this form of learning stems from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditions of narrative, and that story sharing was the way they managed their dynamic connection to country, transmit knowledge, and learn about the world. Though this pedagogical approach is highly entwined in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, it is also one that has been reflected in Western culture throughout history, and therefore it stands to reason that its approach is effective across a diverse range of cultures. Its application in modern classrooms will be explored later in the presentation. The second way of learning is through community links. This pedagogy focuses on bringing learning back into group-orientated, localized context. Extensive research has been done on the benefits of collaborative learning and the importance of keeping learning based in real-world contexts. This element of the 8-Way framework highlights the benefit of keeping learning linked to the community in order to improve learning outcomes. The deconstruct-reconstruct method of learning bears striking resemblance to the popular Western method of scaffolded learning. Students begin by interpreting a concept or text as a whole before breaking it into manageable parts and reconstructing the text over time, gaining meaning from each element as they go. Non-linear learning refers to the way information is procured in a holistic way, rather than prescribed to students throughout a methodical process. Oftentimes, new learning is revisited and reaffirmed in the students' minds. This approach allows students to further apply learning to real-world contexts by learning in a real-world way. Learning with reference to land links holds particular value to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. As their connection to country is part of their identity, it makes sense that their learning is most benefited by incorporating local context and evidence. This is a strategy that can benefit all students, however, as it takes students further into contextualizing their knowledge acquisition. Relying on the use of symbols and images can be highly effective in teaching quick recall and memorizing complex subjects. By incorporating metaphor and symbols and relating them to specific topics, a teacher can frame a student's understanding and recollection of a subject, and prompt students using a single word, picture, or element. Non-verbal learning promotes the use of tangible resources, kinesthetic learning, and the art of creating one's own experience and practice. It is similar in some respects to the constructivist approach, where students test ideas in their creation of new knowledge. Finally, the eighth pedagogical approach of this framework is learning maps. This approach is highly collaborative between the learners and the teacher. It allows both parties to visualize the pathways of knowledge, create a picture of the learning process, and guides the learners through the educative process. This can be implemented at the start of a unit, as an overarching guide, or on a smaller scale with each activity implemented in classes. Now that we have a greater understanding of each of the 8 ways of learning within this framework, let's take a closer look at how 3 of them can be explicitly implemented in a secondary school English classroom to address the diverse nature of our students. In this specific context, a class is entering into a unit of study where the focus genre is poetry. The first approach to be applied will be story sharing. This approach can be most effective as a diagnostic tool at the beginning of a teaching unit to determine students' prior knowledge and experiences within a topic. In the context being discussed today, students are encouraged to create a yarning circle, preferably in an open space outside of the classroom, to stimulate a more open discussion. Different forms of open and inquiry-based questions are asked by the teacher to lead a discussion surrounding students' knowledge about and experiences of poetry. These could be questions such as, what are some examples of poetry that you have heard before? What is the purpose of poetry? Or what kinds of structure does this genre have? Is it fixed or fluid? The aim of this activity is to get students to think about when they have previously experienced the genre and how this has impacted them. This allows learners to share their own experiences and learn from the experiences of their peers, before being explicitly led by their teacher. It also gives every student the opportunity to contribute to the discussion, and it values the diverse backgrounds in a class, as they provide diverse understandings. The second approach to be applied in this unit would be learning maps. By collaboratively constructing a class learning map at the beginning of a unit, the class can gain a visual and tactile understanding of what future lessons will be aimed at, and how they will be constructed. It also places responsibility back on the students for their own learning, giving them ownership and some autonomy. A learning map at the beginning of a poetry unit may begin at exploring some famous poems and the effects they had on their communities or societies after being published. It would then wind through the purpose of poetry before breaking the genre down into specific components and giving the students time to practice their new knowledge. This would all be represented in a collaboratively constructed visual format and displayed in class throughout the unit. The use of tactile and visual resources addresses the learning needs for students who respond well to doing activities and applying their learning in a kinesthetic way. The art of viewing the genre as a whole before reducing it to the basics and building up from there follows the pedagogical approach of deconstruct-reconstruct, which is the third approach we will be applying. This approach can be utilised in planning entire topics or units, as was seen in the learning map, but can also be effectively used in a single activity or lesson. In this instance, it can be highly effective when studying a single poetic text as a class or a small group. Students will first read the text as a whole, considering its effect, aim, and purpose. They will look into the context of the poem by exploring when and where it was written and by whom. Once the poem is understood as a whole, the deconstructing process begins. This can be done practically by breaking up sections or stanzas of the poem and distributing it among groups, before analysing its structure, poetic devices, and other elements of the genre. From here, students bring the poem together again and read it with a renewed understanding of how all of the elements of the poetic genre can provide added meaning and context. These tasks are relatively collaborative, involve delving into the context, and can easily promote inclusivity in the lesson. To take it one step further, Students can also be encouraged to attempt their own forms of poetry to share, if they feel brave enough. These are just 3 simple ways in which elements of the 8-way framework can be introduced to a typical English lesson, thus valuing diversity and implementing inclusive practice. It is easy to see how, through the interrelated nature of each pedagogy, these activities also incorporate elements of community links, land links, and non-linear learning, and can easily be adapted to address the other strategies too. It is also important to mention that, although designed as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander pedagogy, this framework is an effective approach that addresses the learning needs of most students when used effectively. This makes it an incredible tool when striving for inclusivity in our teaching practice.